Hey neighbor, welcome back to ARTV. My name is John and it's time for a review of the 6th studio album by the English indie and alternative rock band Foals. This is Everything Not Saved Will Be Lost Part 2, which follows up Part 1 that dropped earlier in 2019. Releasing 2 albums in the same year is a bit of a gamble. Not to say that it hasn't been pulled off successfully. Look to System of a Down, Mesmerize, and Hypnotize. Now, Part 1, when I reviewed it, it wasn't necessarily an album of the year contender or anything, but it's one of those records that even though I didn't score it extremely positively, I really do come back to a lot of the songs more than I thought I would. In Degrees, Syrups, White Onions, On the Luna, that one's so danceable. Sunday, a lot of great moments there, including the single Exits, so why doubt them if they say they got enough material for Part 2? This record was opened up by the lead single Black Bull, which is the most aggressive thing that we've seen from this era, and I was 110% on board. They really sold me on the energy. The second single, The Runner, another fantastic moment. It was stacking up to be something that I expected to be great, so did we get that? It's a bit of a complicated listen here on Part 2. This is not to say that it's not necessarily well played or well sung or well produced, although there are a few problems with each of those things, at least in places. I think that this record is just a bit more in a box creatively. It's not as imaginative as, say, Part 1 was. This feels like a continued exploration of the themes that they tried out. They tested the waters, and then they doubled down on it. But after listening to both of them, and then not only separately, but then playing them from start to finish, Part 1 into Part 2, all 20 tracks, I just feel that this could have been chopped down to, say, 12 to 14, and it would have been a much more enjoyable experience. Foals knew what they were doing when they put out the 2 lead singles as Black Bull and The Runner, because I feel those are the best tracks on here. I mean, there's definitely a few competitors, don't get me wrong, but those are extremely solid Foals tunes. And then there's some meandering, wandering points where they just seem to lose focus. A couple of the tracks almost feel like they're emulating other groups. And the sound is not as distinct as I would hope it would be for Foals. It seems like they're kind of coasting, and they don't really do that as a band. So that's pretty disappointing to see. I think the vocals are definitely sharp on a lot of these. The tunes that do stand out absolutely do. 10,000 Feet, for example, has some great poetic lyrics that really roll off and totally grab you into the atmosphere. But then there's others that just kind of aimlessly wander into the surf. And it's not always a bad thing. Some people are going to enjoy that. It does feel like an artistic statement in a way, but at times, you just kind of lose yourself on that statement and you just zone out and you're like, okay, is this really pushing the envelope for the band at all? It's not that atmosphere wasn't a huge chunk of the road to success for Part 1, because it definitely was. It's just that the atmosphere here on Part 2, instead of going into space a lot of times, it just feels more grounded. There's some nice guitar work. It definitely feels slick here and there. There's some nice bass grooves that it slips into, a couple of synth melodies that do linger in the back of your head, and obviously Yannis Philippakis as a lead vocalist, he can definitely get aggressive on some of these tunes. He puts himself into the limelight as he should. That's definitely something that's always stood out about Foals. But also, it kind of feels like a regression, like they've fallen back onto some ideas that did get tossed into the B-side bin when they were creating the album, and instead they were like, let's put out a Part 2. And as a result, this just kind of feels like unfinished in a way. It's not that it doesn't have a nice flow. I think they did a great job at making the tracks connect. Even Part 1 and Part 2. If you listen to Into the Surf, and then obviously the Part 1 of that on Part 1 of this 2-part series of albums, I just feel that there's some puzzle pieces missing. Running out the clock to make this a 40-minute listen is also a bit frustrating because it feels like a couple of the interludes could have been cut. I do like the opening track. I will say Red Desert is pretty. It does a nice job at picturing serenity and then going into The Runner, which is a fantastic track. Can't get those guitars out of my head. It has some great drums that just fall into the sway of things, and also Yannis's vocals on this track are incredible. So poignant, biting, and sharp. That hook remains in your head for days. But at other points in the record, you start to realize that maybe they're dragging their feet a bit. Some of these tracks could have been condensed. And I will point to the closing track, Neptune, which is a fantastic listen. I'm not trying to take that away from it. It's over 10 minutes. It could have been condensed down to about 6. I think a lot of people are going to enjoy the fact that it does just kind of jam out. It lets itself just fall into some sort of zone or hypnosis. But at the same time, the good ideas that were there could have been packaged just a bit more tightly. It's like when Amazon sends you an entire box for just one little CD. Moments like Wash Off are perfectly fine, although I can't say that they really do a ton to push Foals forward into a dominating force that makes you want to continue listening to the album. I also have a huge issue with a track that sounds like the Black Keys, but also another band called Kaleo. You might know their song like Way Down We Go. I think that they had a huge problem on the track Like Lightning because they fall into this routine of sounding a little bit scuzzy, a little bit bluesy. It doesn't really sound like Foals. And instead of it feeling like an influence, it just kind of overtakes it. It's definitely the black sheep on this album, not the black bull. However, 10,000 Feet is fantastic though. As I noted, the writing style there, the really dreamy aesthetic that they have going on, it totally paints you into the story. You can get easily invested in that. I like the closing 3 tracks here a whole lot. It starts with 10,000 Feet, Into the Surf carries on the mood of part 1 that was started back in March. And I feel that this track in particular does a great job at just elevating musically. And then Neptune, obviously a great closer, could have been condensed a little, but still not a huge complaint, especially when there's this grandiose swell that really continues to punch at you the more you listen. Overall, this 2-part series of albums was certainly worthwhile because there's so many great Foals tunes here. And as a weighted score, I don't normally do this. I rated part 1 a 4, and as far as my rating for Everything Not Saved Will Be Lost part 2 goes, I'm going to rate this project a 3 out of 5. A weighted out of 10 score for both of those, obviously, if you add those numbers together, is a 7.5 out of 10. And I think a 7 or a 7.5 is definitely fair for this project as a 2-part series. I would love to know what you guys think, though. This is all just my opinion. Sound off in the comment section down below. Hey, don't forget to drop a like on this video while you're here. I appreciate you watching. And if you want to see my review of part 1, then tap this card right here, or tap here for another recent alternative or indie review. All of my social media accounts, including my Patreon, if you'd like to help support the channel, can be found in the description down below, and I'll see you soon for more right here on ARTV.